then I can't see everybody. So if you have a question or a comment, you don't have to raise your hand. If you just want to unmute and jump in, we're really informal and you're welcome to do that. And you're also welcome to type in the chat. There's a couple of us watching that. And so we'll see your question in the chat, get to it as soon as possible. So we'll get started. And Ashley, welcome. Thank you for being with us today and being willing to share your story. I appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here. I've done a lot of thinking about like the best way to share it. And then about 15 minutes ago, I was like, I'm just going to do it. That's how I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do it. And said a little, said a little prayer and did a little bit of a meditation to come into this space. So I was born in 1986. I grew up in West Jefferson, North Carolina. My mom was a single mother from the moment I was born. I'm pretty sure I'm the product of a one-night stand in Myrtle Beach. She came home from the hospital to my grandparents' house, and we lived there for several years. Before I was born, and I learned this much later in my life, my mom had already been hospitalized multiple times for mental health concerns. My grandmother said that she had a bipolar diagnosis. My aunt and uncle told me that that was a borderline personality diagnosis, but I think what's most important is that my mother was incredibly mentally ill, and my grandparents both knew this. My grandparents played a huge part in my growth and development and keeping me safe. And those people are who I have to this day. That's who I equate safety with, and love, and that feeling of unconditional love. When I was 3, I was diagnosed with cancer. It was, and my very earliest memories come from that time of my life. A lot of blood work, surgery, cancer treatment. And I can remember learning then that what I needed to do to be good was to follow directions, and that even if something was painful, I needed to ignore that pain in order to follow those directions, and that's what good girls did. For the most part, my grandparents my grandparents remained super involved in my life. My mom got married when I was 5 years old. She gave birth to 2 siblings that I have, and we all lived together, but I spent all of my extra time, all of my weekends with my grandmother and grandfather. When I was 10 years old, everything changed. My grandfather was diagnosed with lung cancer, and at the beginning of like June, it was end of May, beginning of June in 1996. He was given 2 years to live, and in 6 weeks he died. Shortly after my grandfather died, sexual abuse started from a family member. My mom's I was now fully with my mother. Her mental illness was like full-fledged. She was also dealing with the loss of her father. My grandmother went through like a huge dark period of depression. And in the midst of all of this, sexual abuse is happening, physical abuse is happening, emotional abuse is happening. And I have no skills. I'm a 10-year-old, right? I have no skills to cope with any of this. My abuser introduced me to alcohol. So I learned at 10 years old that if I wanted to ignore the way that I felt or change the way that I felt, I could do that by using a substance. I, at 12 years old, came forward about the abuse to my mother. My mother physically attacked me, did not believe me, accused me of trying to, break up our family. And I was sent to live with my aunt and my grandmother. My aunt and my grandmother did the best that they could, and I see that now. The resources that were available at that time were, they didn't know. There was this belief within my family and my community that if something like this happened to you, that you needed to kind of ignore it and pretend it didn't. And I was told repeatedly that I didn't want to be known as the girl that all these things had happened to. I was never going to have a boyfriend. I was never going to have normal friends. So I learned those lessons like pretty rapidly. Within like 3 years, not only had I lost any sense of like safety and been through these like horribly traumatic events, um, I also was taking in all this information from the world around me. Um, I started to use drugs around that time as well. Just things that were quote normal at the time, like smoking pot. I started to hang out with people that were older than me because I thought those were the only people that could understand me. When I reached out to like a youth pastor that I had at that time in my life and said, I don't understand why these things have happened to me, that youth minister told me that God would not give me more than I could handle. So I had grown up with this like belief that if I prayed hard enough, God would keep me safe. And so God didn't do that in my eyes. I then, go and say, well, this thing happened. And they told me that, God loved me and wanted me to be strong. Um, and I didn't think that's how love worked. And I know now that's not how love works. So at 13, I denounced God. I started to run with an older crowd and experiment with drugs and alcohol. I knew that the only time I didn't feel ashamed and afraid was when I was under the influence. The only time I felt connected to anybody else, um, or like I was able to disconnect from the trauma, was if I was using drugs or alcohol. They became my only coping mechanism. I started to seek out relationships with men who were like me, men who came from broken families, men who I felt like I could relate to. I had been told over and over again that if boys knew what had happened to me, they would see me as damaged. They wouldn't want me. So I sought out men that I thought were just as damaged and who were doing the same things that I was doing and that, I felt could understand me. At like 17, I found out I was pregnant with my son. It was my senior year of high school. I was an excellent student. I knew as a child that the one time I felt loved by my mother and the one time that she gave me praise was when I brought home good grades. And so I brought home good grades. I was the yearbook editor. Outside appearances, I was fine, but as soon as I left school, I was like partying nonstop. I look back at it now and I'm like, I don't know how I like I don't know how I held those things together, but I was able to. When I found out I was pregnant with my son, I had teachers, I had principals at my school that had always believed in me, which I think was like one of the most important things was having, teachers that believed in me. And when I came forward about the abuse, my grandmother believed me. And so having those two pieces, like someone who believed me and someone who believed in me, were huge. Um, I wanted so desperately to go to college. I wanted to also be a mother. I made my mind up that I was going to do both of those things at the same time. And I tried incredibly hard to, but I also had already developed highly addictive behaviors and completely unhealthy coping mechanisms. Um, I had DSS involvement early in my son's life. I managed to find some stability for a while, and then I gave birth to a daughter. Was in a long relationship with her father that was chaotic, and but also he was always a sweet soul. We were both just incredibly addicted. um, our addiction kind of whacked. It was like cyclical for 7 years. We would have, periods of stability where I graduated college. I was working as a teacher. We held it together really well. And then when things fell apart, I found myself going back to old relationships and wound up in a domestically violent marriage to a former partner who was actively selling drugs at that time. Uh, and my life rapidly fell apart over all of the trauma work that I had actually done when I had CPS involvement and had sought mental health services. Then it fell apart. I was being beaten regularly, emotionally abused. Every day of my life I lived in fear and would spend most of my nights like praying that the feds would come and get him, like he was afraid that they were. And eventually, and I know it's not how prayers work, but eventually those prayers were answered and he was arrested. He was indicted and arrested and removed from my life. But I still didn't have any of the resources I needed, any of the coping skills that I needed. I didn't have any of those things, and rapidly hit what I now call rock bottom and entered recovery in 2017. I went to treatment, and I think I'm trying to think of like the best way to go into like the next little bit here. I entered. I'll let you go ahead, Denise.
Yeah, that's okay. I was before you start into the next little bit. I feel like it. I'm just compelled to say, and I've thought about this as I've thought about us talking. The capacity of us to damage one another and the capacity of us to survive, and not just survive, but to thrive, to create a life that has joy and meaning and purpose and peace. Like that just continues to resonate, reverberate in my brain when I talk to you or think about your story. And it's one of the reasons that I continue to want people to share this, is that to me, it's not so much about the horror of what happened, but about our ability to overcome it. And so I just want to continually, stress the strength that you have and the bravery and the determination that you have to try to make a better life for yourself and your children. And that even with our capacity to damage one another, we also have great capacity to heal as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah, when I was talking to somebody about this just the other day, and how like when I tell my story or pieces of my story, or when I even think about it, those voices that told me in the very beginning that nobody was going to believe me are still the same voices that come to the forefront today. I won't go into, super detail about everything, but I still have that voice in the back of my head that says, like, there's no way anyone would believe that all this happened to one person. Um, and that's not true. I do think that people who victimize and abuse other people sought out women like me because it was easy to pick up on that I was so insecure and that I was so, I won't say broken, but cracked. I was very obviously easy to manipulate for a long time, and seeking out like these people and places and things that reinforced that, and I also, like, the only thing that I knew that made me feel any better and any less afraid was to drink or use drugs. I mean, it was absolutely the only thing that I knew. And I knew that anytime I tried to like not do that, I was in constant fear. I, and I had no idea like the impact. I had no idea the history of trauma, like what that had actually done to me as a person. Um, and then in addition to that, like things that happened to me while I was using drugs, I was sexually assaulted. I was beaten by like random, I won't say I was beaten by others drug users, people that I used drugs with, people that I bought drugs from. I put myself in situations out of desperation trying to get drugs that, were not safe. And all of that stuff is what I brought with me into my recovery. When I went to treatment in 2017, and I will always praise JFK ADAC in Black Mountain. They are state funded. It is definitely not like Palisades or whatever that you see on the commercials. But they had a very knowledgeable staff there. And I can remember being in the acute care unit. It was hard for me to breathe. It was hard for me to like look people in the eye. I jumped at literally everything. I always had my back to a wall. And there was a PA there who one day approached me while I was eating and told me that I was hyper vigilant. And I had never heard that before in my life. And he said, "You jump at the slightest noise. We're going to get you in to see the psychiatrist again because I think you might have PTSD." And I said, "Oh no, I'm just here because I use meth and heroin." And he said, "No, I think there's some more other stuff going on here." And when I met with the psychiatrist and they talked to me about my PTSD diagnosis, I absolutely fell apart in that office. I just absolutely, every bit of it, and things that I had not admitted myself, like feeling disconnected from my children, like looking at my kids and knowing that I loved them, but at the same time, not being able to like fully connect to them or any other human being. Um, the PA, he met with me at breakfast and like talked to me about ways that I could make myself gradually become more comfortable. In the beginning, I was not comfortable around men. I was not comfortable being alone with men. I was not comfortable in a room where there were more than two or three men. I had learned my entire life that men were a threat. And what I initially thought was just me being like agitated or aggravated or angry, I began to recognize as fear, as like a fear response coming up in my body. I would often say I couldn't breathe, and the reality of that was I felt like my stomach was in my throat or like someone was sitting on my chest. And I was walking around like this all the time and still had absolutely no coping skills for it. Um, when I left treatment and I was staying at a halfway house in Asheville, it was normal for the women in my halfway house to like accept rides to 12-step meetings with men. I couldn't do that from the beginning. I couldn't do that. Anytime that I got into a car with a man, I was an absolute terror the entire time. After about 9 months, I relapsed. I wasn't seeking the treatment that I now know I needed. There were just several times when I did seek treatment from like local service providers, um, and I was placed in a group, like in a group therapy group, where I was the only woman. Um, I was constantly on edge. When clinicians noticed this, they tried to like hold me accountable by saying things to me like, "You seem really easily triggered." Um, and I didn't have words yet for what I was feeling. I had trouble with transportation. Some people, I'm sure, know that I didn't drive for like 3 years as a result of legal consequences for the life that I had lived. So when I had approached a clinician and said, I don't have transportation here. I have to, walk a mile to a bus stop. This group ends at like 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, and then I'm walking a mile home from the bus stop, up the side of a busy highway. She suggested that I get a ride with another group member. They were all men. I said, I've been told in recovery that I don't have to do the things sober that I did when I was using and getting in the with a strange man is one of those things for me. I was called combative. I was called treatment resistant, that I was non-compliant. Um, and those things continued to reinforce once again all those voices that I had heard for years, I felt like I wasn't believed. I felt like I didn't have a voice. I felt like I was not being heard, and that the things that had happened to me once again didn't matter. I can also say that I came in to recovery. I didn't trust women either. Like I didn't trust women either. I didn't trust anybody. Um, when I think about, and I've thought a lot about like what helped and like what really helped me find like the champions that I needed and the alternatives. My grandmother still to this day, it came to my attention in the past year. I became my grandmother's legal guardian last fall. And when I think about like that woman and all of the things that she provided for me growing up, and then I found out that she herself has a schizophrenia diagnosis and that this has been like this huge family secret for decades. Um, it's in one way, I'm like so incredibly grateful that she I'm able to be that for her. I hate that, my grandmother has like lost competence to the point that she needs that, but I'm so glad that I can give that back to her, and I'm glad that she always, like my grandma always believed me. Um and even when I would show up at her house and was under the influence, she fed me, she loved me, she trusted me even. I can, one of the lines in the sand that I never crossed as a using addict, my grandmother would give me checks for like, she would write me checks for like $20 and say, please don't spend this on drugs. And I wouldn't even cash the checks because I knew that if I cashed them, I would spend it on drugs. And when I had like a year in sobriety, I found like multiple checks like shoved in books that I had never cashed because she had trusted me with $20. Um,
Like, let me stop you just a second, Ashley, because I want to go back to what you were saying about being re-traumatized by systems and also language. Because we've talked on this Wednesday conversations before when people have said, how can I support someone from trauma? Or how can I show someone I love that I'm here? And so one thing that I keep hearing on these, and when I think about myself as well, is like there is a veil of trauma and perception that everything comes through. And so when somebody's like, well, I don't understand how they can perceive everything as a threat. Well, when everything comes through, I'm not worthy, I'm not safe, then things that maybe do seem mundane to other people can be perceived as a threat. So just a great amount of care to not appear threatening, to give choices, to use positive language, to not use blaming kinds of language. Like when you say to someone or to a client that they're resistant or non-cooperative, when maybe the system is not set up for them to be compliant. And so that was one thing that I just wanted really to pick out about just remembering how everything goes through that veil into being perceived a certain way, but also about how critical the way we look at and speak to people who are struggling, whether it's trauma or addiction or whatever it is.
yeah, and I also think that so I had incredibly, by that point, I had incredibly negative um, experiences with providers and with agencies and with the systems that were supposed to keep me safe. I can remember it was like 2015, and my now ex-husband had beaten me pretty badly. A friend of mine took me to the emergency room at the hospital, and when the doctor asked if I wanted to talk to somebody about domestic violence services, and I said absolutely. At this point, I was ready to leave. He brought a police officer, and the police officer didn't want to talk to me about the domestic violence. The police officer wanted to talk to me about the drug activity. And when they brought the person from, that county's domestic violence shelter to talk to me, they asked me if I had used that day, and I said yeah. And they asked if I was currently high, and I said yeah. And then they said that I couldn't access those services until I wasn't. So that taught me that my drug use and my status as a drug user was going to prevent me from seeking help also. I, at one point, had the second time that I had CPS involvement with my children, which led to, their removal and me losing custody. I had a foster care worker who asked me what I was willing to do for my children. And I said anything. And he said, well, I have a friend who's an attorney. He might be willing to trade services for sex. So I had had these experiences with people in these systems and in these agencies that are meant to, keep us safe and to help us and protect us. But because I was a drug user on top of everything else, like, it felt like the only thing that anybody wanted to talk to me about was the drugs, not the underlying causes. Not I was treated as less than human more often than not because of my status as a drug user.
Yeah, exactly. So just a good reminder for people who are working in systems that, we really want to make sure that we're not re-traumatizing. Whenever I have an intern, I always tell them to go to these different agencies and try to get what they're looking for walking in off the street as a client, and just how the waiting room feels and how they're spoken to and how they're treated. And I think it's, clients walking in off the street are often treated much differently than the professionals that are calling to talk with a colleague. And so as representative of different agencies, just keeping that in mind, what our waiting room looks like and how people are spoken to, and the language that we use, whether we're creating blame for an individual rather than talking about our role in re-traumatization. I was going to ask you, oh gosh, I forgot what I was going to ask you, Ashley. I'm sorry. Oh, yes. So did you first hear about childhood trauma and the long-term impacts then at the treatment center in Asheville, or when did that happen for you?
So the first time that trauma came into my awareness, I was 21. I had gone to treatment for the first time, and I was engaged in services with what was then New River, in the Family Solutions program. I had an excellent team at that time. Jody Gardner, Joan Zimmerman, Mike Benoit, Marilyn Langseth. I'm sorry, Marilyn, if you're out there somewhere, you see this. I think that's your last name.
Maybe Laxton. Is it Laxton?
Yes, it was Alice Langseth was my DSS worker. That's where. Okay, yes. So, I had trouble then with being in a group setting, and they let me do individual therapy as an alternative. I just had to do like more individual therapy than I would have. I had trouble with urine screens, all of these things. And at that time, I was given a PTSD diagnosis for all of my childhood stuff, and learned a lot about like how to combat the effects of my trauma. I also was not ready to completely give up alcohol at that time. Like, I was like, okay, I can't do other drugs. That they obviously cause problems for me, but I'm 21 years old. Everybody drinks, and wasn't willing to examine the fact that everybody might drink, but not everybody drinks like I drink, and not everybody drinks to have like all of their feelings go away, or to change them, or to feel something different. When I went to the treatment center in 2017, I learned quite a bit more. And then after I had like relapsed and then came back into abstinence-based recovery, I started going to Narcotics Anonymous, which is a 12-step fellowship. And that really opened a lot of doors for me, because I found identification there. I found a group of people who also had drug problems, who were not using drugs, and who had done a lot of the things I'd done, but I didn't feel like, and I didn't feel judged there. I didn't feel like as afraid there. I didn't feel like all of these barriers were in place. I didn't feel like I was being talked down to. And I connected with other women there who had been through things similar to what I had been through. And one of those women, said, you have to find alternatives. Like, you have to stay in the solution and you have to find alternatives. Like, you've got to find your champions. And what she meant there was that, yeah, like, these systems are screwed up. Our world is screwed up. Society is screwed up. But there are individuals within those systems and within this society that are your champions. There are ways around it, and it's not fair and it's not right that, like, you're going to have to work harder to get the things that you need and that you deserve, but you're capable of doing the work.
And that kind of answers a question that was in the chat. It says, how did you navigate the system mistrust and harassment within the system to develop the resolve to take the next steps for recovery? And she said, are those folks are really good supportive folks to champion for you? So you're kind of answering that question by saying, even within systems you felt like were broken or re-traumatizing, you found individuals that were good and supportive of you.
Yeah. And I knew from my, like, previous experiences with the treatment center and with the Family Solutions program, like, I knew that there were ways to access services other than what were being presented to me. At that time, I didn't have insurance. I was working part-time as a dishwasher. I did have housing assistance. And so, and I didn't have custody of my children. So I didn't have a lot of money to spend, but I knew that I wasn't going to be able to access services at Daymark any longer. I knew that even though those services were free for me, that I knew a stipulation of receiving individual therapy is that you also have to be involved in group therapy. And I knew group therapy was not an option for me, at least not at that point in my journey. So I took that list of names and looked into what those people were doing now. I knew they didn't work for Daymark, and I was able to, I talked to Mike Fenoy. I said, Mike, I don't know if you remember me. It's been at least a decade, but I have to do something, and I can't do Daymark. And, he told me how much it would be per hour, and I would literally not eat to pay for therapy. Like, and that was just, I knew that in order to become the mother that my children needed, I was going to have to do some work on myself. My kids have also experienced trauma as a result of the life that I led. And I know, like, for me, my rock bottom, as people call it, was the night before I went to the treatment center. I got to spend the night with my son, who I was separated from at that time, and I saw that he was exhibiting the same things I did at his age. He was living with his father in an abusive setting at that point in time. He was cutting. And when I saw that damage in his eyes, I knew that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do something to at least give him half a chance, and I really at that point was like, it's, if I have to eat ramen noodles and leftovers from the pizza place, that's what I'll do so that I can, figure out how to make me better.
Yeah, that's another thing that I have heard several times before that also resonates with me, that sometimes we're able to do for our children what we're strong enough to do, not strong enough to do for ourselves. And I'm gonna let you talk about staying well in just a minute, but I want to go back to when you were little and how you were able to compartmentalize and put on a perfect front. Because whether we're teachers or youth leaders or whatever it is, when we're interacting with kids and have a relationship with kids, is there any advice or suggestions you can give to people who have relationships with children? We've talked about kids need a safe space. We've talked about kids need to be believed, but any other thoughts you can share with people that may help kids trust them to confide in them, or at the very minimum, feel safe when they're with them?
Gosh, that's like tough to think about. So I could, my mom was incredibly unstable and yelled a lot. I to this day pick up on, a lot of people say like I'm an empath or I'm like highly attuned to how other people are. Like, you can fold laundry mad at me. Like, that's just, that's the environment that I grew up in. We didn't know what to expect. The teachers and the adults in my life as a child that I felt the safest with, I never heard them like they had really good control of tone, is what I'll say. I never heard volume go up. Things were explained to me like, this is the reason why we're doing this, which was really important to me because at home, nobody explained any of that. Like, we didn't know. My siblings and I talk about it now, and it's like we grew up in a war zone where we didn't know what was real a lot because our mom would tell us just like lie after lie. And I don't know. I still to this day, I don't know if she just believed those things were real. Um, so we had no idea like what was real, and then on top of that, we had no idea what consequences we were gonna receive. We could one thing would be okay one day, and then the next day, she was beating us with a wooden spoon. Um, you know, and that was like normal for us. So having, teachers that explained very clearly, like, oh, okay, well, this is what we're going to do, and this is why we're going to do it. And if we don't do it, this is what's going to happen. And having those expectations laid out. My third grade teacher at Mountain View Elementary School, Mrs. Beth Shelton, she to this day is like one of my biggest cheerleaders and holds a special spot in my heart because she not only like believed in me academically but like saw something in me as far as like writing and the way that I viewed the world, and really tried to foster those things and say like, oh well, yeah, you perform well, but like you seem to really enjoy this thing. And to this day, like writing is one of my favorite pastimes. It became an amazing coping skill and strategy for me. Um, and that was one of the things that she gave me early on.
Thanks for those tips. I thought it was interesting that you said tone never changed, or at least it stayed regulated. We're training in schools, we talk about the use of sarcasm and how confusing it is for people and how disruptive it is in a relationship because it suddenly makes you not sure if you're safe or not. And so when you're talking about tone, that was one thing that reminded me of that. And how what you said about folding laundry, I can tell if you're mad at me. I think we have either a fantasy or an illusion, or we want to believe that people don't pick up on whatever's really running in us underneath the surface, but that kids and people know what's really happening. It's like we talk about children know if you're strong enough to hear their story. They also know if you're mad at them or frustrated with them, and it's not really something that you can hide. Even if you think that on the surface your face is neutral, they still pick up on those things that you're feeling. So those are all really good tips. Thank you for sharing those. So, long journey, incredible resilience. Can you talk to us some about how you stay on your path and stay well, and the things that you do to help yourself maintain the life that you've created?
Yeah. So I mentioned 12-step recovery a few minutes ago. It has remained like one of my biggest uh, supportive areas, like one of the places where I fill my cup. It's important for me to have the identification with other people in recovery, having other people who have had similar experiences that I can go to and say, oh, I just had this like thing come up that, this is where my mind went. And, most of the time they say, oh, you're not, that's just normal. That's, that's what happens with us. Or to say, I did this thing while I was using to this person and I don't really, I feel shame about it. And to be told like, well, there's nothing that you can do about that now, but what can we do moving forward? And so having that group of people who share that experience and who have also found a new way to live is paramount to my existence today. I remain active in that. It's been at first it was really challenging with COVID-19, but I was able to reconnect with like the original group that I joined when I got clean and sober. And so, I do that meeting twice a week now. And then there are a couple of in-person meetings that I've added in, since things have settled a little bit. Exercise became really important to me, which in the beginning created an additional barrier because a lot of gym culture is based around masculinity. And I had like joined a gym locally and went there for a couple of months and never felt like safe there. I had learned at that point like how to recognize like that fight or flight response coming up in my body, and I had tools for dealing with that. But I also knew that I didn't want to like put myself in this space where, the point is to like get your heart rate up. And I was able to find, I took that advice. I continue to take that advice of like, find your champions, and somebody told me about Rev 5 Fitness and the people there. And, I kind of was like a stalker and just like scoped them out a few times and, would just kind of like walk by and look. And I didn't see that like toxic masculinity or any of that happening there. And so, that became a safe place for me. And at that same time, I was doing a lot of like mind body connection work. The connection between my mind and body I had severed that a long time ago because it was a lot easier for me to go about my life if those two things weren't connected. I was able to, set goals for myself that way and really challenge myself physically and to feel strong, and that, with the exception of times when I was using drugs, I had never felt strong before, and to be able to do that without drugs was like huge. It continues to be a big part of my recovery today. My ex-husband was released from prison last year, so I got my ass back in therapy. Like, that was like, I knew things were going to come up. Things came up. And so, I'm seeing someone now, and that's, therapy is like a huge tool for me. I'm actually in the clinical mental health counseling program at ASU. And I think about that like constantly. Like, I don't know how anybody could be doing any of this work without doing this work for themselves or on themselves. And I also think that gives me some insight into what quite frankly appears to be total burnout that I experienced from clinicians like in these systems.
Well, and that's one thing you haven't said when you're talking about being in therapy, is that you not only are putting a lot of energy into recovery and staying well, but you're also working in school, doing an internship, and parenting. And so a lot of things going on for you still currently. So more important than ever, I would guess, to try to stay centered and focused and healthy and well. Those are all really important. And we talk, it seems to be a running theme of exercise, therapy, and you mentioned recovery and connection. One thing I wanted to say, if you don't know Rev 5, the owner of that is Derek Lale, and you and I have talked about him before, Ashley. He did a podcast with me on trauma-informed coaching. So he is very much into the world of when you come from trauma, everything goes through that lens, and wanting people at his gym to understand that people react to different types of motivation in different ways. And so some people may react to the, screaming and yelling and let's go. And other people need a much more gentle encouragement, kind of positive positivity kind of thing. So if you don't know about that space, I think a lot of people think it's a really good place to be. And so a couple things about the audience. If you haven't put your name in the chat, if you'll do that so we know you're here. And if you're not getting emails from us and would like to, add your email as well. If anybody has anything that they would like to say or ask Ashley, she's happy to do that. So you're welcome to type it in the chat or just unmute and ask her question directly. Anything, Ashley, that I have not asked you about or that we haven't talked about you feel like is an important thing? Oh, somebody said, where's the exercise program? How do you spell it? So you want to tell them some more about that, and I'll type in the chat.
So Rev 5 Fitness is over on Greenway Road. They are next door to like Blue Ridge Peds. What I was impressed with from the very beginning was like the incredibly strong female presence there. Like they have women there who have been through things. They have programming that is like specifically for women in recovery from a variety of things, from eating disorders to trauma to addiction. And I don't, you should just go check them out. You can find them. I won't do them justice. I can just say like the environment was one that I needed in order to flourish. I can also say like my church became like an incredibly, I had learned all of these things like about God from people that weren't prepared for me to tell them about the things that I, had been through. And I don't know if we have any faith community people on here. I don't know if any faith community people will watch this. But I can say that, the answers I received as a kid were like terrible. And I don't know, like learn about trauma and how to be trauma informed, especially when working with youth. I was convinced at the age of 13 that either there was no God or he hated me. And it wasn't until like much later, I go to Cornerstone Summit here in Boone. And, when I got there, I had waited for a long time for Pastor Reggie to talk about hate and like condemn people to hell because that was what I was used to. And, quite often before going to Cornerstone, when I would try to go to churches, I would receive this messaging of like, all of these things are condemnable. And they were things that had either happened to me or that I had taken, I had taken an active role in while high. And so I finally was able to find like this church that, was about love and community and that reconciled, this like spirituality that I had with this morality issue. And, I've been plugged in there. I continue to serve in any way that I can and have throughout the pandemic. And just community. I think that's like the overall like thing is community. I've found this like theme of like start where you're at and then meet people where you're at, and now it's kind of like be where you're at, without the supportive network that I have at work, at school, around my home, around my children. And I am a single mom, but it's not often that I feel that. We have just this beautiful net that holds us, and I'm eternally grateful for that. And I know that like a lot of people talk about like be who you needed as a child, and when I go into like work, I'm trying to be who I needed as an adult. Like it was too late for me to have that person or to be that person in my mind. But if my experience with people at all those different levels with all those different systems had been a little bit different, I don't think it would have taken me as long to get here.
Yeah, makes sense. There's some chat comments coming in, Ashley, and I'll be sure and copy all these for you and paste them and send them to you in an email. I do that every time so that people it's very hard to be talking and reading chat at the same time. So if you don't want to ask Ashley a question or share a thought, but would like to comment to her in the chat, I'll be copying and pasting those to an email for her so she can save them till later. So you're welcome to put something there. Let's see, any other thing? One of the things was, hold on, I'm gonna make sure we, talking about faith-based and what you said about just the messages that we give children about their own worth. And so whether that's teaching or some volunteer position or faith-based, just being sure. I know I have been with kids in my office and they've talked about having been at a church where they were condemning certain things that went on in their house that children have no control over, and just how the space didn't feel safe for them, that they wanted to be in a place of worship, but that the space didn't feel safe for them because of the way they were talking about things that go on in their house that they had never had any control over. So, and I think that's true for schools and other agencies, just again, with the language of what's acceptable, what's permissible, what seems to be, your word was condemnable. So just continuing to be aware of how we talk about situations in people's houses that we maybe don't know anything about. Are there any other thoughts that you'd like to share with us about anything we haven't talked about yet so far? I'm trying to remember back to our first conversation. I wanted to make sure you touched on some things, and you have. So I guess one of the things I always ask is, if you're speaking to someone who's currently got unresolved trauma, can you say something about how to start, like to begin the healing process, or kind of what comes first, maybe? I'm asking you hard questions that I didn't prompt you for in our first conversation. I'm going to grab all your wisdom I can while you're with me.
Find your champions. Like, that's been the one thing that's really stuck with me through all of this, is that, you know, it's hard to seek out sometimes. I think that's becoming a little easier or I hope, that's my hope for WCCI, is that, you know, it's becoming a little easier for people to find their champions in this community. But we're out here, you know, like, we're out here trying to, like, provide and hold space for you. You know, not every journey through recovery is going to look like mine, and not every journey through recovery should look like mine. But those same people that helped me are still in this community today. I did want to say a little bit about, like, so my kids were like a huge motivator for me, because you know, luckily, whether it be whatever that moment of clarity for me was, like, I knew that I couldn't put my son through the same things I had been through. I knew I didn't want, he was and continues to be way too much like me. I say that my daughter is like a physical mirror and he is like an internal mirror, of like looking at myself. But at the same time, you know, I had people telling me that if I loved my kids, I would stop. And I knew that I loved my kids, but I didn't know how to stop, you know? And I think that that's like an important piece for people to realize also. You know, it becomes that, do you view like addiction and mental illness as a disease, or do you view it as a moral failing? Because I knew with everything in me that I did love my children, and that, you know, I did want to be their mother, and I desperately wanted to be everything that they needed me to be, but I had no idea how to do that, you know, and I had to seek out teachers, and I had to, you know, figure out who my champions were. And that's, you know, that's what I try to do professionally today, is to be a champion for the people that we serve, and to take into account, like I primarily work with people who use drugs. I have yet to talk to a client who doesn't have some history of trauma. You know, honestly, when I talk to other women in recovery, I can't think of a single one, and I have a pretty extensive network at this point. I can't think of a single woman in my recovery network that hasn't experienced some sort of trauma over the course of her life.
I was reading something a few weeks ago that said people who have been victimized have significantly greater chance of being victimized in the future. So just, it puts you at risk to be victimized just from being victimized. And I like what you said about being a champion. We've said that before as well, that we have to believe in other people's when they don't believe in themselves. And it makes me think of, and I say this every time it comes up, Kelly Reed Ashcraft, who for, I don't know, 10 or 12 years kept asking me when I was getting a master's degree, when it never even crossed my mind that that was a possibility for me. And it never would have crossed my mind, ever, if she hadn't said for 10 years that it was a possibility for me. And so just thinking about how we can be that for other people who don't believe in themselves, like us believing in them may be the first time that they've ever known that that was even a possibility, that somebody could believe in them. So I wrote that down and started, find your champion and be someone's champion. I don't think you came to the first conference when we had Tony or Kane, and she was talking about years of addiction and assault and incarceration and children being removed. And she said, it's not our right to ever give up on someone. Like, you never know when today is going to be the day that somebody's ready to hear something that you have to say, or the spark catches, you know, that's been there all the time and it finally ignites. And so just not giving up hope, which is a delicate balance with still maintaining boundaries, but being champions for others and not giving up hope and still taking care of ourselves. So all wise words that I have written down and put stars beside. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Mary. Anything else you'd like to share with us before we go? We got a couple more minutes. I so appreciate you being here and being willing to share your story. I know you've done that some in the recovery community, but this is a new space for you. So thanks for being brave and strong, and just so appreciate your resilience and determination and your commitment to doing things differently, especially for your own children. So thank you for your strength and bravery.
Thank you.
We're going to let everybody go, I think, unless Ashley can think of one last thing to say. If you have something to say to Ashley, you're welcome to type it in the chat and I'll send it directly to her. Hope to see you again next week. Ashley, thanks for spending time with me. It is an honor to get to hear more about your story and your experiences and some of your wisdom. So thank you for that. I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Take good care. See you next time.